I'm Holly Lycoglan. Hi, I'm Holly Lycoglan, the Principal Research Lead for Process and Performance Management at APQC. Thank you all for joining today's webinar, Boundless Benchmarking, Revolutionizing Business Models with Open Standards. It is my pleasure to introduce today's speakers. Lisa Higgins is the President and CEO at APQC. Lisa's primary focus has been to assist organizations in cost optimization while building capabilities that support business objectives. She was a key driver in the formation of APQC's Open Standards Benchmarking Collaborative, which established a universal process framework and performance metrics created by industry for industry. Anthony Marshall is a Senior Director of Thought Leadership at IBM's Institute for Business Value, leading top-rated thought leadership and analysis program. He oversees a global team of 60 technology and industry experts, statisticians, economists, and analysts. Anthony is personally active in conducting original thought leadership in areas including innovation, digital transformation, and artificial intelligence, as well as cloud strategy. And Kirsten Crysel is an associate partner at IBM's IBV and leads IBM's performance data and benchmarking capability globally, which seeks to evaluate business performance and provide action-oriented insights in the areas of strategic, operational, and back office processes. And Jacob Dencik is responsible for leading IBV's research on topics at the intersection of technology, the global economy, and sustainability. He leads IBV's thought leadership on sustainability and has co-authored numerous papers on this topic, as well as extensive experience advising companies around the world on their global operations. So without further ado, I would like to hand it off to you, Lisa and Anthony, to get us started.
Thanks so much, Holly. And welcome, everyone. We're glad you were able to join us today. I want to talk just for a second about APQC. We are a member-based nonprofit organization. We serve about 550 member organizations around the world, representing tens of thousands of individuals inside of those organizations who come to APQC looking for benchmarks, best practices, tools, templates, and information on knowledge management, benchmarking, process, and performance excellence. And we have been around since 1977, and I'm thrilled to say that IBM has been a business partner with APQC since our formation in 1977. And with that, I'll turn it over to Anthony to share a little bit about the IBV.
Thank you, Lisa, and it's really great to be here. And you know, the collaboration over the past 2 decades with APQC and IBM has been, you know, a tremendous partnership, and particularly with the IBM Institute for Business Value, which I'll talk about shortly. You know, we've been working together very, very intimately on multiple surveys and projects, and I think it's really culminating in this study that we're jointly publishing today, looking not just back at the last 20 years, but forward, and the very exciting territory that we're all about to start our voyage on, and the centrality of the open standard and APQC to that. So the IBM Institute for Business Value is the thought leadership part of IBM. And so, as Holly mentioned, we're an organization of around 60 researchers covering multiple areas. Of course, being IBM, we focus on technology and the impact on technology on business, the economy, society, focusing specifically on hybrid cloud and AI, and the transformational benefits that both of those technology can bring, in addition to other very topical areas such as sustainability and the like. So we are a global organization. We've got regional IBVs all around the world, from Japan to China to Latin America, through Europe and the rest of Asia Pacific. And we produce probably around 120 pieces of thought leadership every year. In terms of major studies, which tend to be big investments, lots of original research, lots of original surveying, we probably produce around 23, 25 major studies. And the differentiating thing about the IBM Institute for Business Value is that we are completely based around data. And so we don't produce anything that's not based or founded on data. And in the analysis that we're about to go through today, that is also all around data that we have sourced uniquely and proprietarily with APQC, looking at executives around the world and really how they perceive benchmarking, how they perceive the future of benchmarking and the open standard within ecosystems, and how important that has been and will be in their business going forward. Next slide, I think. Just go back. Yeah.
So over 18 years ago to be exact, APQC and IBM came together with 12 other leading organizations with the goal of providing access to standardized process frameworks, standardized process measures, definitions, and data. We were building on the concepts that we had seen take off in the open source software and how open source software was allowing for greater innovation, improvement in the technology space. APQC and IBM came together, and then the 12 other organizations joined us in order to identify what those common measures were for organizational business practices that happened across an enterprise. And in turn, then began to not only put the measures in place, the standardized definitions, the taxonomies to support them, but to collect the data. And today we have over 4 million data points in the Open Standards repository, supporting over 1,200 measures and 25 process frameworks. And so the thought was that organizations could no longer afford the cost and time it took to benchmark idiosyncratic measures and processes. So if we were to be able to provide common definitions and the data supporting those definitions and measures, we would make it possible for anyone inside the organization to access data at their fingertips and be able to have information real time to use in the decision-making process.
So we're going to look at the business impact of benchmarking right now. And given that you're here in this webinar, it's very clear that you see the business benefits of benchmarking, but we had the benefit of exploring the real value that's derived from benchmarking by engaging with these executives that we surveyed around the world. And that gave us a really interesting insight into how benchmarking is being used today, what value it's driving today, and also what the value is likely to be into the future. And really, it's extremely probable, and we predict that the value, while significant today, is only going to increase exponentially in the future as we go into and embrace more of an ecosystem economy. We're going to talk about that a little bit more later. Let's jump to the next slide. All right, some really compelling pieces of data that we found. And again, this is from our survey. This is what executives are telling us from their experiencing. The executives that we surveyed around the world have indicated that they believe that the average value, the value that's derived from benchmarking directly and indirectly for their organization comprises 7% of revenue. Just think about that for a moment. 7% of revenue is the value derived from benchmarks. So the average size of the organizations that we surveyed was around $9.5 billion. This was a global survey. In some countries it was smaller, in some countries it was bigger. Inevitably in the United States, we're talking several tens of billions of dollars. Typically, a typical survey that we have in the US is, we're surveying around 20 to $30 billion organizations. So this number would be bigger there. But on average, that 7% translates for these $9.5 billion organizations to a little north of $650 million. And if we sum that across the Fortune 100 organizations, just across the Fortune 100 organizations, that comes to over $1 trillion. $1 trillion of value created from organizations embracing benchmarks to set standards, to produce targets, which helps motivate and make more transparent activities of transformation, other activities to come to best practice, leading practice, and really realizing in their transformational efforts the very best that the benchmarking data reveals is happening elsewhere across industry and the world. Let's jump to the next slide. So 7%, just think, 7% of revenue, $1 trillion across the top 1,000 companies. Now, this is actually showing on this slide that there is a positive correlation between the extent or the extensiveness and benchmarking and the value derived. So just think about this. In terms of the percentage of metrics of which benchmarking is used, this shows that the more ubiquitous is benchmarking in an organization, the more value is derived, and it's a positive relationship. And you can see a couple of step changes here. And you can see that there's a pretty big jump between 26% in the next group of 27 to 32, and then it sort of evens out a little bit. But what we're going to be forecasting in this paper, not explicitly on this slide, but what we're really forecasting is as the ecosystem economy continues to become more mature, this value is set to expand. We're going to talk about more about that later. But why? Because in an ecosystem economy, unless you have common language, unless you have common definitions, then the ecosystem simply fails to operate. If you can't come to consensus around common definitions, metrics, measures, it fails to operate. We'll come back to that more later. But this is, again, very strong positive correlation between the extensiveness of benchmarking deployed in organizations and the value created. And across the top 1,000 organizations, the total that we are estimating based on the survey data, based on what the executives are telling us, is in excess of $1 trillion. Kirsten.
Thank you, Anthony. So benchmarking is a strategic asset. Now, over the years, business leaders have found many ways to improve business performance using benchmarking. It helps them achieve strategic goals, anything from boosting employee retention to streamlining customer experience, virtually across all functions, right? We've seen this. Next slide, please. So today, dashboards place benchmarking information directly into the hands of executives, managers, and frontline employees. And this allows the business to distribute data at each level of the organization, making it much easier to derive insights, make business decisions, and drive, outcomes. Now, 9 in 10 executives say that benchmarking is a strategic management tool which they are using at least quarterly. And when we asked them why they use it as a strategic tool, they said to size the benefit of opportunities, to establish performance targets, and to measure against those targets. Now, I'm going to age myself here a little bit, but I can remember when the only metrics you could benchmark externally were financial metrics, right? And we had to obtain those from public filings in order to be able to compare company performance to others in the same industry, the same geo, et cetera. And if you even wanted a glimpse into what they might have been doing in sales or supply chain, you had to use public metrics like DSO and inventory turns, right? So now today, executives are telling us that 28% of the most important metrics that are used for setting their goals and objectives can be benchmarked externally. That is real progress, which we can attribute to having an open standard for benchmarks. And I anticipate that we will see a real increase in this percentage particularly when areas like ESG and cybersecurity start to have recognized and standardized metrics, which start to hit that executive dashboard. Next slide, please. So when improving performance, while improving performance, actually, so will always be important, to business leaders. We have learned that today's executive expects benchmarking to serve more strategic goals. In fact, 80% of the business leaders in the survey said that accelerating breakthroughs or innovation was the most important benefit from benchmarking. And leaders are becoming much more creative in how they're using benchmarking to gain traction in their transformational programs. 72% said they're using benchmarking to drive organizational change, and 71% are using benchmarking to drive organizational transformation. Next slide, please. So unsurprisingly, actually, executives are extending the role of benchmarking to cover more functions as new agendas arise, for the enterprise. And this expansion will likely outpace many of the traditional areas for benchmarking, like finance and HR and IT. So the graph on the left here shows the level of benchmarking usage that they said 3 years ago, today, and what they expect 3 years from now in each of the various areas. And for example, the executives are telling us that over a 6-year span, their use of benchmarking in sustainability and risk management will increase by more than 150%. They also expect that benchmarking in ecosystem management is going to grow an amazing 243%. That is huge, right? So this is a real opportunity, to standardize metrics in these areas, to make them part of that executive dashboard going forward, because they're going to want to benchmark them externally. So let's hear from Lisa. She's going to tell us a little bit about how CMI is using benchmarking to drive improvement.
Thanks, Kirsten. And it is amazing that 20 years ago, when we started the open standards, areas like cybersecurity weren't even on the radar screen. And today, they're one of the fastest growing areas for benchmarking. So I want to talk a little bit about one of APQC's member companies, CMI, which is a South American large multinational conglomerate organization. And they use benchmarking in 3 different ways. First of all, they are very keen on conducting internal benchmarking on a regular basis so that they can look at each one of their organizations and identify and then transfer best practices across the organization. So internal benchmarking is definitely one of the applications that they have. In addition, they complement the internal benchmarking with 2 types of external benchmarking. The first is external performance benchmarking. So they look at readily available data in the open standards and identify areas of improvement using data that they have accessed through the benchmarking portal, and then apply that internally across the organization. In addition, they conduct practice benchmarking. So whether it is to identify someone within or outside of their organization and identify those organizations that are higher performers and then be able to understand their practices when compared to CMI's internal practices. They then bring those practices back to the organization and deploy them across the organization. So one of the areas that is high on their list of using benchmarking is in their digital transformation and the ability to take those lessons from the digital transformation efforts that they have embarked upon and identify and use them in other ways. Jacob, you want to talk a little bit about extracting the value from process mining?
Yes, thank you. If we move to the next slide, please. So one thing we want to understand, in addition to given all the growth we're seeing in the use of benchmarking and the considerable business value we identified from it, we also want to explore how the context in which benchmarking is taking place is changing, and it's changing quite considerably. And one of the dominant trends that are shaping a new environment and context for benchmarking is the growing digitization and digital transformation that organizations are undergoing. So, for example, more functions and more processes are being digitized, and they're also being increasingly supported by IT systems. So if we go to the next slide, please. And that growth of an acceleration in digital transformation, as well as the growth of these IT systems that underpin more function and processes, they generate vast amounts of data. Big data is a term we all work with these days, but there's huge amounts of data around how different, about what goes on within different processes and within different functions of the organization. And that vast amount of data is increasingly being used to also understand how you can improve processes. And the key tool or mechanism that's being used in that context is what's called process mining, which is essentially mining that vast amount of data to understand what goes on, applying analytics to it, to identify any performance issues, bottlenecks, or also any root causes of any problems that they have in their processes. And so it's an opportunity to gain much more detailed and granular and nuanced insights into what goes on within a particular business process in your organization. And with the acceleration and digitalization, many organizations are now embracing the opportunities of process mining as well, and applying that in their efforts to improve how their organization performs. So we found, for example, in our survey that 65% are already tapping into this potential of process mining, which is actually a much higher percentage than we thought, because it's a relatively new technique or methodology or tool to use, but it's very rapidly being embraced. And as with by organizations, and as with benchmarking, the executives we surveyed are also expecting a rapid growth in the use of benchmarking, not just for core functions like HR and IT and CRM, where you have established IT systems in place, if you like ERP and CRM systems that many organizations have these days, but also across a number of other areas like sustainability, ESG, like cybersecurity. So a number of that functional spread you're seeing with benchmarking is being mirrored in some respects, and also in the use of process mining. Now, one thing to be mindful of in the context of process mining is that the ability to use it is very tied in to your digitization of a functional process. You need to have IT systems that generate and capture this data in order to be able to apply process mining techniques to that data. So the ability to extend process mining across your organization is very much dependent on the availability of these IT systems that capture and integrate and make such data available. But we're seeing a rapid growth in process mining as we do with benchmarking. If we go to the next slide, please. And what's driving this are very similar rationales as for benchmarking. It's to see, obviously, improvement, how you can make improvements in your processes and in your particular functions, as well as see as how you perform against expectations. So those are the main reasons organization embrace process mining. But as with benchmarking, we're also seeing a shift in how process mining is being used, that it's trying to drive more innovation, drive more breakthroughs and transformation initiatives as well. So again, a trend that is mirroring what we see for benchmarking. Now, crucially, if we go to the next slide, please, what's very important to appreciate is that the executives we survey and the organizations we talk to, they see process mining and benchmarking as complementary tools. So whilst they're both offering opportunities to make significant and vast improvements to the way your organization operates, and also drive transformation and innovation efforts, when you combine the two, that's where you get most value from both of them. The vast majority of executives we surveyed, then they actually see the integration of benchmarking and process mining as one of the key opportunities for extracting and generating even greater value from both of these techniques. And actually, very few organizations that we spoke to are looking to in any way replace, say, benchmarking with process. They're really looking for complementarities and looking for them to add additional value to each other. So they to generate even greater value than what we saw that we've seen already from benchmarking. And with that, I would like to hand it back to you, Lisa. I think we have a case study on how one organization is combining those two techniques in a very effective way.
Yes, thank you, Jacob. And this particular organization is a global consumer packaged goods organization. And they have taken benchmarking and dashboards that they use inside the organization to the next level. They have taken the data that comprises the dashboards used by business leaders across the organization and turned it into information and knowledge. So their dashboards are configured such that they provide the ability to alter a target or a performance level and understand the implication across the given process. So if they were to set a target of a cycle time of 2 days, and they want to understand what happens organizationally if they change that target to 1 day, both from a process perspective, a cost perspective, and a cycle time perspective. So they look at these dashboards and use them as algorithms to identify opportunities for change throughout the organization. They also use them to identify early warning signs. So when the data reflects a lower than expected output, they are able to identify the early warning sign and act accordingly. They do compare their current performance against the target performance found within the dashboards, and the dashboard then provides report outs for gaps, where the issues are within the process. And so this is a real state-of-the-art application in that they can program in the algorithms and understand the predictive change based on a process change or outcome.
All right, so we're back talking about benchmarking ecosystems again. Let's jump to the next slide. So traditionally, if we think about 20 years ago or 18 years ago, as Lisa mentioned, and organizations embracing benchmarking, it was really about inside the organization. How can I bring data from competitors, from best in breed, from leading practice, and bring them so that I can apply them inside my organization and get that external insight so that I can do whatever I need to do in order to improve processes, generate efficiencies, engage in transformation, to set targets based on those benchmarks and that sort of activity. And so it's really bringing external data into the internal environment of an organization in order to leverage that, to get the benefit from that. Now let's think about that in terms of forming partnerships in a go-to-market type of approach. And so if you're forming a partnership and you're engaging in business activities, clearly you need to come to some sort of consensus about metrics and measurements and definitions and all the rest of it. And so in that environment, you really have the opportunity to negotiate with a partner, your partner organization, or a series of partners in order to come to a consensus agreement around that. Now let's think about an ecosystem where you've got, instead of n is equal to 1, that is you, to n is equal to 2, you and a partner, you've got n is equal to who knows what. It could be 5, it could be 25, it could be 5,000 organizations engaging in an ecosystem. How could you possibly negotiate that on a bespoke basis in order to come up with common definitions, common metrics, common measurements in order to even begin to be the contracting? It's just impossible to scale at those levels. Therefore, the importance of an open standard, agreed measures, agreed metrics, agreed definitions to make an ecosystem operate. Without those things, without an open standard, without an agreement, without the sort of things that APQC brings to the marketplace, then that sort of stuff is just becoming unfeasible. And our data that we have from a series of studies before COVID, during COVID, and even now showed that businesses are really committed to engaging in ecosystems. Before COVID, we saw progressive increase in embracing of ecosystems. Something like went from 30% of organizations to 40% of organizations over a couple of years. During COVID, it jumped from 40 to something like 80+% of organizations have ecosystem engagement as central to their business strategy. And so ecosystem engagement is permeating across organizations, really across markets. And so the thing that can impede ecosystem engagement and all of the innovation, all of the open innovation, open collaboration inherent in that is not having this common language. And so the executives that we've surveyed are picking up on this reality, and Jacob has some specific data to reflect that. Jacob.
Yeah, thanks, Anthony. Yeah, so we were indeed very curious about whether executives that are using benchmarking today are already engaging with the ecosystem partners on their benchmarking efforts in recognition of the fact that the way value is being created by an organization is changing. As they open up and engage with more partners, they can't just confine their benchmarking efforts to their internal business processes, but really need to look end to end and see how what they do as an organization interacts with all these ecosystem partners in shaping that value for their end customers. And what was very encouraging actually in the data was that 73% of the organizations we surveyed who are active sort of benchmarking users, they are already coordinating their benchmarking objectives with their ecosystem partners. So they are engaging in these conversations around how do we need to collaborate and coordinate to create that common language that Anthony referred to in order to make sure that we can enhance the value and make benchmarking even more relevant in this new ecosystem economy we're going to work in and where we're going to create value with partners all the time. But if we go to the next slide, what also became clear in both the survey data and also in the analysis of the data we did was that there's a recognized clear opportunity for enhancing the value from benchmarking through this collaborative ecosystem approach. It does also add a lot of complexity. Once you start having to coordinate your efforts with all these partners to create this common language, it's not an easy task, and you have to actually be very strategic and considerate in how you do this and invest, if you like, the required efforts to create that common language. And this is really where open standards is the key, and it helps because it helps tackle the complexity that ecosystem engagement creates or could create for your organization. And if we go to the next slide, please. And what we found was that about 3/4 of the executives agree that common definitions are absolutely essential for accurate benchmarking. So clear recognition of the importance of open standards and how that is becoming even more important in the context of ecosystems. There is clearly still work to be done. And 44% of those who surveyed actually say that inadequate common definitions of process framework hold them back, both within their own organizations, but in particular also as they engage with ecosystem partners. That lack of common definitions is one of the key barriers to not only tapping extra and additional value from benchmarking as they extend the depth and breadth of the use of benchmarking, but also from combining it and integrating with tools like process mining, where open standards are also absolutely key requirements. So this is an area that's growing recognition about. It's a huge opportunity for extracting and creating extra value from benchmarking, but it does require that open standard. It makes the open standard even more important going forward. And with that, I'll hand it over to Lisa, who has a great case study around how ecosystem engagement and benchmarking can work in tandem.
Thank you so much, Jacob. I want to talk a little bit about Tetra Pak. Tetra Pak would be considered under any standards as a mature process-centric organization. They are a global organization headquartered out of Switzerland, and they have begun benchmarking and using the ecosystem partners within the European communities for which they're located to conduct benchmarking. Now, they take and go into the ecosystem 1 to 3 times a year, depending on availability, problems they're trying to solve, and look at benchmarking with partners such as Volvo and Bosch. And with these organizations, they share data and practices. And not only is this multinational food packaging and processing organization very process-centric, they have identified and have roles for global process owners throughout the organization. These global process owners are responsible for identifying 3-year process roadmaps for all of the strategic and core processes throughout the organization. So needless to say, there's no shortage of opportunity in what areas that they identify could be potential areas to examine within their roadmaps. They use benchmarking to help prioritize what those roadmaps will include and what the targets are for those processes that meet the criteria of a roadmap and being able to examine it over that period of time that it is under scrutiny. So they use both a customized and a standard data approach. So for idiosyncratic areas, they will run custom benchmarks on an annual basis, but more frequently, they find that using standard definitions and standards available through the open standards to access and compare data is the most beneficial approach. And so they do believe that over time, more and more of their benchmarking will be done using open standards access. They also believe that databases like the open standards have an opportunity in the future to even expand further than what they specialize in today. So one of the things that when we started the research that we're reporting out on today, we wanted to look at what had happened over the last 18 years since we had launched the open standards. But like the great hockey player Wayne Gretzky said, we didn't only want to see where the puck was, we wanted to understand where the puck was going. And so a lot of the work that we did was to understand where organizations were driving benchmarking forward and how they were intending to use it in the future. And I know Kirsten mentioned earlier some of the emerging areas like cybersecurity and ESG reporting and sustainability areas that were not on the horizon 18 years ago and are now becoming strategic to the organization, and the need for data real time is growing in those areas faster than in the areas that we originally launched the open standard to support. So our focus was not only on the past, but what's going to happen in the future. And so one of the things that we had was takeaways. And so after having surveyed over 2,000 organizations, we wanted to come together and say, what were the actions that organizations can actually take away and implement to make benchmarking more strategic inside of their organization? And one of those was how organizations, as Anthony noted earlier, are using benchmarking more strategically. Yes, they're still using it in those basic accounting processes and payroll and HR, but they're now looking at benchmarking as being a strategic enabler for the future of the organization. And so to do that, process, the measure, using inside of their organization. And they turn to the open standard to say, what are those standards out there being used and how are organizations deploying those standards inside? 2, to align the measures that they use both on functional business unit dashboards as well as strategic dashboards, all the way through cascading to the strategic propositions for the organization. So each of those dashboards should align and link to both top down, bottom up, and tie to the strategic value that the organization is placing upon benchmarking. The other thing was go beyond the traditional benchmarking of cost and productivity and begin to look at some of these other areas that are emerging. So as Anthony noted earlier, the greatest value is derived based on the breadth and depth for where benchmarking is applied. So the ability to embed benchmarking in planning cycles, identify the strategic areas for which its application can be benefited from. Those are some of the actions that you can take away in driving benchmarking into the organizational strategy.
Kirsten, you're on mute.
Oh, sorry about that. I thought I had come off mute. So action 2 is about expanding benchmarking into ecosystems. And as both Anthony and Jacob have said, you know, the ecosystem working environment, that is a reality, right? Organizations are going to have to transform and work in an ecosystem environment. And so in order to do that, organizations have to pivot, and they have to be able to use benchmarking to support the transformation of their workflows through this greater ecosystem engagement. So expanding benchmarking to external partners, it sounds complicated, right? But it actually can be achieved with some practical steps. And the first step of that is to first, incorporate benchmarking into your own ecosystem strategy. You have to identify where value can be created in the ecosystem and align your benchmarking efforts to that. You want to use benchmarking to size the benefit and help you in prioritizing your opportunities. Second, you've got to transform your benchmarking model. How you used to do benchmarking is not necessarily exactly like you're going to do benchmarking going forward, working within an ecosystem. So you will have to adjust your benchmarking practices as well as develop some new approaches to support that new ecosystem strategy. Thirdly, you need to use benchmarking to orchestrate your ecosystem participation. And that really means you need to develop shared definitions, metrics, frameworks with your ecosystem partners. And you have to benchmark based on the role that your organization is going to play within that ecosystem. And fourth, you have to enable future progress, right? You have to invest in technology and architecture that is going to support that integration and engagement, as well as sharing data at scale. That's particularly important in order to do all the other things that the organizations will want to do in this ecosystem environment. Next slide, please.
Yes, the third action item that we identified from our findings was also related to how you could create the foundations for extracting greater value from benchmarking, given the new context in which benchmarking is taking place. And in particular, how you could integrate benchmarking into some of these new opportunities that are emerging around, for example, process mining and the big data opportunities associated with that. To do that, the key recommendation here is really that you need to be strategic about it. You need to set out from the beginning, what are you actually hoping to gain from integrating benchmarking and process mining? What are the complementarities that you're after, and how can you, in what areas of your business in particular, what functions are you keen to deploy these tools and methods in order to gain that value that we talked about? And remember, the important thing with process mining and these big data techniques that are associated with that is that you need to have the right digital maturity and IT systems in place to generate the data required for process mining if you want to use it as a mechanism. So you need to assess strategically which parts of your organizations, which functions are the ones that are ready for using a technique like process mining in combination with benchmarking, for example. But once you have that, a key lever for realizing the value potential of both process mining and the integration of process mining and benchmarking are really around what I would call the general data governance issues. It's about arriving at the appropriate definitions of the data again, but also making sure you have the right standards in place for how you define particular metrics, but also the mechanisms by which you generate the data, how you label data, so that the systems and the tools are able, especially as you automate certain things with process mining, are able to use that data in the effort to identify improvement opportunities for your organization. So data governance and the standardization of data and processes is really a key prerequisite, if you like, to tap into the potential of process mining. And the same goes around the methodology and the approach you take for deploying process mining and benchmarking in combination within your organization. These need to be clarified and standardized across your organization. So these governance requirements are really foundational in order to be able to tap into this value potential that we're seeing from, and that executives are telling us they're seeing from integrating process mining with your benchmarking efforts going forward. And with that, I think we are ready to take any questions or comments that you might have.
All right, thank you all for that powerful and insightful presentation. I'm sure everybody got a lot of wonderful value out of it. We do have a few questions that have come in. And the first one is somebody wanted to understand how they can make a business case for benchmarking in their organization that's a federal government body. One that's not concerned with money, but more looking rather at spending the dollar more effectively in the long run. So who has some insights on building that business case?
Well, I'll take a first pass and then throw it over to my colleagues at IBM. That's a common question asked of governmental entities. And I think that there are other value propositions besides just revenue increase. The more cost savings that can be applied, the further the federal dollars go in spending and being able to add value back to its citizens. But there's also the piece of job satisfaction, employee retention, and being able to be thought of from a leadership perspective. I can give you an example of the US Navy, who is very keen on benchmarking. And one of the things, if we can touch base offline, is I can put you in touch with a contact at the US Navy that can help you answer that question from a governmental perspective, understanding that is comes with a set of unique situations. Any other thoughts on that, Kirsten or Anthony? Jacob?
I think you covered very well. I just want to stress and re-emphasize the point that you mentioned employee satisfaction and customer satisfaction. Our data show that actually organizations across all industries, both public and private sector, see huge positive impacts from using benchmarking on those particular performance measures or objectives as well. So it's not all, it's not just for revenue generating organizations that this is very relevant. What we did was we quantified the value as a percentage of revenue, but that doesn't mean, this is just a way of measuring the dollar metric, if you like. The value from benchmarking comes from the performance improvements, from the innovation that it drives, from the transformation efforts that it supports, and that applies across all industries. And it manifests itself in a number of different outcomes, like employee happiness and customer satisfaction or citizen satisfaction, etc. as well.
The other element here, in terms of the philosophy of commercialization, which is really about applying private sector, the best in private sector business practices to public administration. And so the more that government entities can bring in the best or leading practices through benchmarking into their operations, the easier the business case to justify one's existence and to reset expectations that, you know, if you're performing like a private sector organization at that level, then, you know, all sorts of things can flow out of that, including salary and all the other things in terms of benchmarking. And so there's all sorts of opportunities to really reposition, and you know, the benefits of that can be enormous.
Thanks, Anthony. Holly, there's a question out on the chat that is a great question that I'd like to jump to real fast, and it's Brad's question, and he says, When implementing benchmarking to drive strategy, what do you recommend for scope when the benchmarking or solution crosses organizational boundaries, typically getting the response that is, that's not my problem? And that is such an important question. Quickly, value chain benchmarking is hard. There is no doubt about it. And the first thing I would suggest is to find a stakeholder that thinks beyond just their functional level and can wear an organizational hat that spans that function. Typically, the more senior the individual is, the more ownership that they will have across that value chain. And then find the pain point within that value chain. And that's a good starting point. But I know that my colleagues at IBM have addressed this inside of their clients as well. So I want to get their advice and response to that particular question, because it's a great one.
It's also, I think, Lisa, it's also having a consortia, if you will, of subject matter experts across the value chain. So some, IT clearly is an important part, but so is the business and product owners. Having the knowledge across those various aspects is critical. So it's sort of triangulating to understanding the value chain, if you will, based across the various disciplines of knowledge. Kirsten, you were going to say something?
Yes, I was going to say that the idea of finding that common pain point is important, because if you think about it, that does happen as you're looking at intelligent workflows. So for example, it could be customer, right? It could be about customer satisfaction and NPS scores that transcend the typical process function. It could be around talent and employee satisfaction that moves across multiple processes as well. So I think it's real important to find out what problem you're solving. And we also know in a lot of the work we've done that it's the handoffs that occur between processes, right, where a lot of times the biggest inefficiency happens. And so you have to have, even though they may not think it's their problem, the handoff from them to the next person could be part of the problem, right? So.
All right, I think we have time for one more question. If we don't get to your question, we'll make sure to follow up and get everybody answers to all of the questions that have been submitted. And I think I love this question that Todd asked, which is APQC has led open standards benchmarking for over 17 years. What's next on your roadmap as more companies see the value in OSB and open standards benchmarking?
Well, I think right now, one of the things that we're seeing is the expansion into other areas. So 18 years ago, one of the goals of creating the open standard was to have process benchmarks available in core areas like human resources, supply chain, finance and accounting, because organizations no longer wanted to spend upwards of 6 figures and wait 6 months to get data back to drive change inside of their organization. So with leaders like IBM coming together and saying, let's create a repository of common measures, common definitions, frameworks that these all fit into, and then provide data so that organizations can benchmark by identifying the measure they want to look at, the peer group they want to compare to, both in demographic, size of organization, and industry, and that they can then readily access at their fingertips that data. What we've seen is that functional, transactional, operational data is still very valuable. However, because of the value that benchmarking has derived over the last 18 years, we're seeing very strategic areas emerging for benchmarking. And across the partners like IBM, we are investing in things like ESG reporting benchmarks and what are the common measures that organizations should apply in their sustainability efforts. What are the common measures to use and adopt for things like cloud services and technology? So we're taking that whole concept around making standardized measures, common definitions, and data available to other parts of organizational value streams.
All right, well, thank you all very much. Thank you all for attending the webinar. And also thank you, Lisa, Anthony, Kirsten, and Jacob for sharing the data from this great research, as well as all of your expertise. And thank you again, like I said, everybody for joining. So the next step is that we have put together a full white paper in combination with APQC and IBM, exploring all of this information. You can download the full report either using the hyperlink or using the QR code. And all of this information will also be sent to you over the next 1 to 2 business days, including the link to the webinar, the slides, as well as, again, another link to this white paper. So thank you all again, and I hope everyone has a lovely day.
Thank you, Holly.
Thank you.
you.